The dust rose in small clouds around Margaret's worn boots as she stumbled across the yard, the weight of the water bucket pulling at her shoulder. Her brother-in-law's voice cut through the morning air like a whip crack, sharp and cruel as always. "Move faster, woman. Those horses won't water themselves." She quickened her pace, though her ribs ached from where his wife had shoved her against the fence post yesterday. 3 years had passed since Thomas died, leaving her at the mercy of his brother's family, and each day felt heavier than the last. They'd taken her in, they reminded her constantly, given her a roof over her head when she had nothing. The price for that charity was extracted from her body and spirit every single day. Margaret poured the water into the trough, her hands trembling slightly. She was only 28, but she felt ancient, worn down like the stones in the creek bed. Her dark hair, once glossy and thick, hung in a limp braid down her back. Her dress, patched and repatched, hung loose on her thinning frame. "You call that work?" Clara, her sister-in-law, appeared in the barn doorway, arms crossed over her ample chest. "My grandmother could move faster, and she's been dead 10 years. Margaret said nothing. She'd learned that silence was the only response that didn't earn her more bruises. She kept her eyes down and moved toward the chicken coop. Her next task in the endless list of chores that filled her days from dawn until long after dark. The slap came without warning, snapping her head to the side. Her cheek burned, and tears sprang to her eyes, though she blinked them back furiously. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," Clara hissed. "You're worthless. My brother must have been desperate to marry something like you." Margaret raised her eyes, meeting Clara's cold gaze for just a moment before lowering them again. In that brief glance, she saw the satisfaction there, the pleasure Clara took in her suffering. It wasn't about the work or the water or anything Margaret did or didn't do. It was simply that Clara enjoyed the cruelty, and Margaret was powerless to stop it. The sound of hoofbeats made them both turn. A rider was approaching from the direction of town, and as he drew closer, Margaret recognized him. Everyone in 3 counties knew James Thornton. He owned the largest ranch in the territory, thousands of acres stretching across the valley and up into the foothills. He was a man of few words but considerable presence, tall and broad, shouldered, with silver threading through his dark hair despite being only in his early 40s. Clara smoothed her dress and arranged her face into a smile, the transformation so quick and complete that Margaret might have doubted what had happened moments before if her cheek weren't still stinging. "Mr. Thornton, what a pleasure. Won't you come in for some coffee?" James Thornton dismounted in one fluid motion and removed his hat. His eyes, a startling gray-blue, swept over Clara briefly before settling on Margaret. She felt the weight of his gaze and instinctively touched her burning cheek, then dropped her hand, ashamed. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, addressing Clara but still looking at Margaret, "I've come to speak with you and your husband on a matter of business." Of course. Robert is just in the barn. I'll fetch him." Clara hurried off, her earlier venom replaced with sugary sweetness. Margaret turned to go, to disappear as she always did when visitors came, but Mr. Thornton's voice stopped her. "Mrs. Hayes," she froze, surprised he even knew her name. She'd seen him in town perhaps half a dozen times in 3 years, always at a distance. Men like James Thornton didn't notice women like her. Yes, sir, that cheek needs tending too. Heat flooded her face, shame, and something else she couldn't name. "It's nothing, sir. I'm clumsy. I walked into the barn door." His expression didn't change, but something flickered in those gray-blue eyes. "I see." Robert emerged from the barn with Clara, his face arranged in an obsequious smile. "Mr. Thornton, what brings you to our humble property?" James Thornton replaced his hat. "I'd like to speak with you and your wife. Inside, if you please." Margaret watched them disappear into the small farmhouse, wondering what business a man like Thornton could possibly have with Robert Sullivan. Robert's farm was barely profitable, just 40 acres of stubborn soil and a handful of livestock. Perhaps Mr. Thornton wanted to buy the land. The thought sent a chill through her. If the Sullivans sold the farm, where would she go? She returned to her chores, mucking out the stables with mechanical efficiency born of repetition. The sun climbed higher, and still the meeting continued inside. Finally, after nearly an hour, the door opened and the three of them emerged. Clara looked furious, her face mottled red. Robert appeared confused, uncertain, and James Thornton looked exactly as he had before, unreadable as stone. Margaret, Robert's voice cracked like a whip. "Get over here." She set down the pitchfork and approached, her heart hammering. What had she done now? What new punishment awaited her? "Mr. Thornton has made us an offer," Robert said, the words seeming to stick in his throat. "A generous offer for you." Margaret stared at him, not understanding. James Thornton stepped forward. "Mrs. Hayes, I'm in need of a wife. I'm offering to marry you with your consent. In exchange, I'll pay your family a sum sufficient to settle their debts and provide security for their future." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Margaret grabbed the fence post for support. What? He's buying you?" Clara spat, unable to contain herself. "Like livestock. I'm offering marriage," James Thornton corrected, his voice level, but carrying an edge. "Mrs. Hayes is free to refuse." "The hell she is," Robert sputtered. "We've fed her, clothed her, kept her for 3 years, and she's worked off any debt owed thrice over, by my calculation." James Thornton interrupted. His eyes found Margaret's again. "The choice is yours, Mrs. Hayes, no one else's." Margaret's mind reeled. This made no sense. James Thornton could have any woman he wanted. Women far prettier, younger, with dowries and social standing. Why would he want a beaten-down widow with nothing to her name? Why? The word escaped before she could stop it. A slight smile touched his lips, the first softening she'd seen in his expression. That's the first question anyone with sense would ask. He paused, seeming to consider his words. "I need a wife who won't expect romance or affection, who understands that marriage can be a practical arrangement. I need someone who knows how to work, who won't complain about the isolation of ranch life, and I need someone who won't ask more of me than I'm willing to give." It wasn't flattering, but it was honest. Margaret appreciated that more than pretty lies. "And what would you expect of me, sir?" "Running the household, keeping the books. I understand you have a head for figures, helping with the ranch when needed, being my wife in name, and if you're willing in fact." He said this last part matter-of-factly, without embarrassment or presumption. "In return, you'll have a home, protection, and respect. No one will raise a hand to you in my house." The promise in those words made her throat tight. "And if I refuse, then you refuse. I'll leave, and we'll not speak of this again." Clara made a strangled sound. Robert's face turned purple. They needed this money, Margaret realized. They needed it desperately. But James Thornton had said the choice was hers. She looked at the farm around her, the place that had been her prison for 3 years. She looked at Clara's hateful face, Robert's cruel eyes. She thought of her small room, barely bigger than a closet, where she lay each night too exhausted to even cry. She thought of the bruises, the verbal lashes, the grinding hopelessness of each identical day. "Yes," she said quietly, "I'll marry you." The wedding took place 3 days later in town, a brief ceremony with the judge and 2 witnesses James Thornton brought from his ranch. Margaret wore her one decent dress, cleaned and pressed, and held a small bouquet of wildflowers, one of the ranch hands had awkwardly thrust into her hands that morning. She'd spent those 3 days in a strange limbo. The Sullivans didn't beat her. They wouldn't risk damaging James Thornton's property now. But they made her feel their resentment in 1,000 small ways. Clara alternated between icy silence and bitter commentary about how Margaret had always been scheming, always planning to find a way out. Robert counted and recounted the money Mr. Thornton had given them, his eyes gleaming with greed, even as his mouth twisted with resentment at losing his free labor. Margaret felt nothing. She was hollow, emptied out, moving through the motions, because there was nothing else to do. She didn't let herself hope. Hope was dangerous. Hope could hurt you worse than any beating. When she spoke her vows, her voice was steady. James Thornton's voice was steady too, deep and measured. He slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, and she noticed his hands were calloused, working hands despite his wealth. When the judge pronounced them married, James leaned down and kissed her cheek gently, avoiding the fading bruise there. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Thornton?" he asked. Mrs. Thornton. She wasn't Margaret Hayes anymore, the widow who'd been left with nothing. She wasn't the unwanted burden in her in-laws' home. She was Mrs. Thornton now, though she had no idea what that meant. The ride to the ranch took 2 hours. James kept the pace easy, occasionally pointing out landmarks or boundaries of his property. Margaret rode the horse he'd brought for her, a gentle mare with kind eyes. She'd always loved riding, back before Thomas died, before everything became about mere survival. The ranch house appeared as they crested a hill, and Margaret caught her breath. It was beautiful, a sprawling two-story structure of timber and stone, with a wide porch wrapping around the front and side. Barns and outbuildings dotted the landscape, all well maintained and orderly. In the distance, cattle grazed across rolling pastures, and the mountains rose up behind it, all like protective sentinels. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's home." James said simply, "You're home now." He helped her dismount, his hands gentle but impersonal, and led her inside. The interior was surprisingly warm and comfortable, furnished with sturdy pieces that spoke of quality without ostentation. Everything was neat, but had a dusty, unused quality that spoke of a house without a woman's touch for some time. "I'll show you around," James said. "Your room is upstairs." "My room?" she asked, surprised. He glanced at her. "I told you I wouldn't expect more than you're willing to give. You'll have your own space. If and when you want to share mine, you need only say so. But there's no requirement, Margaret. I want to be clear about that." She nodded, not trusting her voice. When was the last time someone had cared about what she wanted? He showed her through the house, the large kitchen with its modern stove, the library filled with books, the comfortable sitting room, and upstairs, the bedrooms. Hers was spacious and bright, with large windows overlooking the valley. The bed was bigger than any she'd ever slept in, covered with a beautiful quilt. There was a wardrobe, a dresser, a washstand, and even a small desk by the window. "I took the liberty of having some things made up for you," James said, opening the wardrobe to reveal several dresses in practical fabrics, but well-made and new. "If they don't fit, or you don't like them, we'll get others." Margaret touched the fabric of a blue calico dress, overwhelmed. "They're lovely, thank you. I'll leave you to settle in. Supper's at 6. Rosa, the cook, will have it ready. You'll meet her and the household staff then." He paused at the door. "Margaret, you're safe here. I want you to believe that." Then he was gone, his footsteps receding down the hallway. Margaret sank onto the bed and finally let herself cry, not from sadness exactly, but from the overwhelming strangeness of it all. This morning she'd woken in her tiny room at the Sullivans', bracing herself for another day of cruelty. Tonight she was in this beautiful room, married to a man she barely knew, safe in a way she hadn't been in years. She didn't understand why. That was the part that kept circling through her mind. James Thornton had said he needed a practical wife, but he could have found that in a dozen women. Why her? Why someone so thoroughly broken down and used up? The answer came slowly over the following weeks, not in words but in observations. James ran his ranch with precision and fairness. He expected hard work from his men, but he paid them well and treated them with respect. He was up before dawn every day, working alongside his hands when needed, handling accounts and decisions in his office when required. He was a man of routines and systems, of careful planning and execution. And he was, Margaret gradually realized, profoundly lonely. Not in a way that made him mope or complain. James Thornton wasn't given to self-pity, but she saw it in the way he sat alone in his study each evening, in the careful distance he kept from everyone around him, in the precise, measured way he moved through his days as if emotions were dangerous things that needed to be controlled at all times. She learned his story in pieces, from Rosa, the cook, and the ranch hands who gradually warmed to her presence. James had been engaged once, 15 years ago, to the daughter of a neighboring rancher. She'd been beautiful and vivacious, and by all accounts, they'd been in love. But a week before the wedding, she'd run off with a gambler passing through town, leaving James humiliated and heartbroken. He'd never courted another woman after that, throwing himself into building his ranch into an empire instead. "He don't trust easy," Rosa told Margaret one afternoon as they worked together in the kitchen. Rosa had been suspicious of Margaret at first, protective of James, but had gradually thawed as she watched Margaret work tirelessly without complaint. That woman, she broke something in him, made him think love was just another kind of lie. Margaret understood then. James hadn't chosen her despite her circumstances, he'd chosen her because of them. He'd wanted someone who wouldn't expect love, who wouldn't demand emotional intimacy he couldn't give. He'd seen her bruises and her beaten-down spirit and thought, here's someone who won't ask for my heart because she knows how little such things can be worth. It should have made her angry, being chosen for her brokenness, but instead, she found it almost funny in a sad way. Two damaged people making a practical arrangement, both trying to protect themselves from further hurt. The strange thing was, it worked. Margaret threw herself into running the household with the same fierce dedication she'd once had to bring to the Sullivans' farm, but this time it was different. This time her work was appreciated. James noticed everything. The way she'd reorganized the kitchen for efficiency, how she'd mended his shirts with tiny, invisible stitches, the accounts she kept with perfect accuracy. He thanked her, he praised her work to others. He never once raised his voice to her or his hand. And slowly, carefully, Margaret began to heal. She started to stand a little straighter. She began to eat more at meals, and color returned to her cheeks. She let Rosa teach her new recipes, and she spent her evenings reading in the library, rediscovering the joy she'd once taken in books. She rode out to check the herds with James sometimes, and she found herself laughing at one of the ranch hands' jokes, the sound so unfamiliar it startled her. 3 months into their marriage, Margaret knocked on James's bedroom door late one evening. When he opened it, surprise clear on his face, she met his eyes steadily. "I'd like to be your wife," she said quietly, truly, "if the offer still stands." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, pleasure, maybe even tenderness. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." He reached out and took her hand, the first real gesture of affection he'd initiated. Margaret, I need you to understand something. I chose you because I thought you wouldn't expect love from me. I thought we could have a marriage of convenience and both be satisfied with that." He paused, his thumb rubbing gently across her knuckles. "But I was wrong." Her heart stuttered. "Wrong? I didn't expect to care for you the way I do. I didn't expect to find myself watching for your smile, or listening for your voice, or lying awake thinking about you in the next room." He drew her closer, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek, carefully, as if she were something precious. "I was trying to protect myself from being hurt again, and I chose you thinking you were too broken to hurt me. But Margaret, you're the strongest person I've ever known, and somewhere along the way, I fell in love with you." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I thought you married me because I was convenient, because I wouldn't ask for anything you didn't want to give." "That's what I told myself," he admitted. "But the truth, when I rode up to that farm and saw your brother-in-law's wife strike you, saw you standing there taking it, saw the strength it took just to keep going day after day in that hell, something in me recognized something in you. I told myself it was practical, but really, I think I was already half in love with you before I even made the offer. I just didn't know it yet." "I don't know if I know how to love anymore," Margaret whispered. "They beat it out of me, James. The Sullivans, they made me feel like I was nothing, like I deserved every blow, every cruel word. Some days I still hear Clara's voice telling me I'm worthless." "You're not nothing." His voice was fierce now, his hands framing her face. "You're everything, and I will spend every day of the rest of my life proving that to you if you'll let me." She kissed him then, pouring into it all the feelings she'd been too afraid to acknowledge, gratitude and hope, and the first tender shoots of love growing up through the cracked soil of her heart. Their marriage truly began that night, not with the ceremony months before, but with this honest acknowledgment of what they'd both been running from and what they'd found despite themselves. The seasons turned. Margaret grew stronger, more confident. She became known throughout the county as a gracious hostess and a shrewd judge of cattle. She learned to laugh again, freely and often. She even started singing while she worked, and the sound would make James stop whatever he was doing just to listen, a smile playing at his lips. They had their difficult moments. Margaret still woke sometimes from nightmares of the Sullivans' farm, trembling and disoriented. James still struggled to express his feelings, to lower the walls he'd built around his heart, but they worked through it together, with patience and honesty and growing trust. 2 years after their wedding, Margaret was pregnant. James was terrified and tender by turns, hovering over her until she laughingly shooed him away to let her work. Their daughter was born on a spring morning, with James holding Margaret's hand through it all, and when he held their child for the first time, Margaret saw tears on his face. "She's perfect," he whispered, "like her mother." "She's ours," Margaret corrected, reaching up to touch his face. "Both of ours, born from 2 broken people who figured out how to be whole together." The old Margaret, the one who'd been beaten down and made to feel worthless, would never have believed she could have this: a home filled with love, a husband who cherished her, a child born of hope rather than duty. But that Margaret had been wrong about so many things. She'd been wrong that she was nothing. Wrong that love was a weakness. Wrong that her broken pieces could never be put back together into something beautiful. Sometimes, when the weather was fine and the work was done, Margaret and James would sit on the porch in the evening, watching the sun set over their land. She'd lean against him, his arm around her shoulders, and think about that day he'd ridden up to the Sullivans' farm with his impossible offer. He'd told everyone he married her because he needed a practical wife, someone who understood that marriage was a business arrangement. And maybe he'd even believed it himself at the time. But the truth they'd both come to understand, was simpler and more profound. He'd married her because somewhere in his guarded heart he'd recognized a kindred spirit, someone else who knew what it meant to be hurt, to be broken, to keep going anyway. Someone who could understand the walls he'd built because she'd built her own. He'd married her not despite her wounds, but because of them, because they matched his own. And in the matching, in the careful tending of each other's damaged places, they'd both found healing. Years later, when their children asked how they met, James would smile at Margaret across the dinner table and say, "Your mother was the strongest person I'd ever met, and I was smart enough to know." And Margaret would smile back, remembering the woman she'd been and marveling at the woman she'd become, and she'd think that sometimes the best love stories are the ones that start not with passion, but with two wounded people deciding to be brave enough to try again.